Hello and welcome to Indie Designers Journal episode 12. I'm very excited that we've reached 12 episodes, and like I've always mentioned in all my videos, if you can please like and subscribe, and more importantly, if you could leave comments below. I like answering any questions that you have or seeing what ideas or suggestions that you guys have. So anyways, today's episode is going to be slightly different. We're not going to be turning the camera around and looking at anything particular on the table. We're going to be discussing game design and one of the more important things, in my opinion, and that is creating tension and investment, making the player feel connected to the experience. So that's what we're going to dive into. I think it's a very important topic. There's a lot of games out there that I wouldn't say a lot of games, but there's games out there that don't do that, and the difference is pretty compelling, because if you want players to continue to come back to your design, you don't want it to be some game that they put in a Rubbermaid container and stick in their basement. If you wanted something to design a game that people take with them on vacation or play regularly, there's certain elements that have to exist, especially if you're creating a solo experience, and I create mostly solo games. So I will be sort of tackling the topic from that perspective, but I think it applies to game design in general. So I'm going to take a little break. We're going to come back and we're going to discuss just that. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to be discussing how to design your games to make them, I guess, compelling, or make people want to come back and play them more often. Now, the type of game I typically design, or 80% of my games, are a dungeon crawl experience, sort of a roguelike experience. Not always set necessarily in a medieval fantasy dungeon. Sometimes you'll be in a spaceship or whatever it might be, but essentially it's an adventure or a quest where a player is working their way through some sort of story or series of events. Now, there are plenty of games out there, and when I say plenty, there's a few, I won't name any names, that don't provide some of the things that I think are required to make a game compelling. Now, I'm going to sort of work my way up into what it is I want to actually talk about by maybe discussing some of the elements from games that I think all of us have experienced, and they can be quite frustrating. And that is when you get a game, and I'm going to be talking primarily about dungeon crawlers or adventure games in general, but there are plenty of games out there where you have, say, a stack of cards in front of you, you shuffle them up, and then you reveal them one at a time to see what happens, right? There's quite a few games like that, and you'll reveal a card, and it'll tell you maybe some narrative or some story, and then it will give you direction and tell you, oh, well, you discovered a treasure, so you get to draw from some sort of treasure deck, or maybe an event occurs and you get to draw from an event deck, or perhaps an enemy, you have to draw from an enemy deck. And sometimes there's nothing like that at all, and maybe there's a series of possible outcomes. You read something and there's a series of possible outcomes, and you roll a dice to see what happens. And it is a game. I'm not saying it's not a game, but what you're creating is just sort of a random series of events. The player is drawing a card, they're reading some text, and then they're going to maybe roll some dice. What's the problem there? The problem is the player is basically having a random things occur to them. They're flipping a card, which is a random act. They're drawing one card, and whatever that card happens to be is what's going to happen to the player. The player has no control over that. Now, if the outcome of that card, or whatever that card might trigger, is also a random thing, like draw a card from another random deck, and or roll some dice to see what happens. You see a lot of these games where there's a chart, roll a dice, and if this happens, this, if you roll this happens, or if you roll that happens. Now, all of these things are fine. They're good. There's plenty of examples of this in my own game, in my own designs. In Iron Helm, certain cards will have you draw a random potion, or draw a random loot card, or draw a random enemy. That's how enemies are brought about in Iron Helm. Now, the issue is getting to that point. And you're not creating any tension in the way I just previously described. You're drawing a card, you're just resolving it, and you're going to do this over and over and over. And the outcome of the game has already been determined from the initial shuffle of the cards, or maybe from some dice rolls in combat. If the combat doesn't have any significant decisions for the player to make, then if you're just rolling a dice, then the whole thing is random. So this brings me to sort of my point of this whole video, and that is you need to have the player making choices. It's as simple as that. If the player is not making any choices, then they're not making any investment, right? So in my way around that, let's just go to how I sort of work my way around that, is in Desolate. There is the mechanic of drawing 2 cards. You reveal one, you decide if you want to resolve that card. If you don't, you have to discard it and you have to resolve the unknown card. Now, I utilize that again in Iron Helm, and in sort of a way I use that in Tin Helm, but what I tried to create was a choice. Now, it's a very minor choice. In the grand scheme of things, it's only 2 cards now, and you're getting to choose from them. Now, you don't maybe necessarily get to see both of the outcomes, but that creates a little pressure luck, and that creates tension, and I'll get to tension in a minute. But if you give that player that choice of 2 cards, now they feel like they're investing something into the game. Now their decision, they're making a decision, might affect the outcome or affect the result. If you don't give a player that option, then there's going to be an emotional disconnect from the game. Now this might seem like really elementary type design stuff, but I still see games coming out that have quite a bit of success, meaning that there may be a crowdfunding that make a lot of money and they continue to see a lot of sales, and they don't have this. And I think if you want to design a game that people are going to keep going back to, you're going to have to implement this. And I am my own worst critic. My games some of my older designs are not that good, and I'm learning these things as I continue to design, and I feel the urge to share these things with people, maybe to create a short step for you. So you want to create a game that has the player making choices, even if it's as simple as you get to choose from 2 cards instead of just revealing a card. Something that simple can have a significant impact. Now, in Desolate also, in most of my games, there's some sort of currency that must be spent during combat. Now in Desolate, for example, you spend ammunition. Each ammunition you spend in combat allows you to roll a dice. So you could spend 2 or 3 or 1, and you get to roll that number of dice. Now an enemy will have an X number of health, and you have to basically beat them, or they get to counter strike you. So if an enemy has 8 health and I have to decide how much ammo to spend, I could tell myself, well, I can't spend 1 because that's only going to have, because we're rolling d6s. So if I roll that, the best I can do is a 6. I can't defeat him in 1 turn. He's going to get to attack me back. I don't want that. So if I roll 2 dice, the probability is obviously I'm going to have an opportunity to defeat him, but the average roll with 2 6-sided dice is 7. So rolling at 8 is going to be slightly less than average. So do I spend 3 dice? Or do I spend 3 energy to roll 3 dice? What is this doing? This is, again, allowing the player to make a decision. So let's say this player decides, well, I'm kind of pressed my luck here. I don't want to spend too much ammunition. I'm only going to spend 2 ammo, and I'm going to roll 2 dice. And let's say they do that and they roll a 7. The alien or whatever they're fighting survives, and it gets to attack, and maybe it does, a substantial attack, does 4 damage or 3 damage, and it really hurts the player. Maybe it kills them, but let's say it doesn't kill them. if the player loses in a couple of turns, they're going to tell themselves, I should have spent 3 ammunition that one turn. If I would have spent 3, I would have killed that alien because I already rolled a 7. One more dice, I would have certainly rolled a value of 8 or a sum of 8. What does that do? That makes the player blame who for their loss? It makes the player blame themselves. And ultimately, as a game designer, as funny as this sounds, you want players to blame themselves. You want them to be making the choices that cause them to lose. Now, like I said, I mostly design solo games, so I try to design games that beat the player, but I obviously leave a window of opportunity for success. But I don't want it just to be players drawing card one after another to see what happens. That's totally random, or just roll a random dice to see what occurs. As fun as that can be, and there's a lot of journaling games out there that basically implement systems like that. Some people do enjoy that. Maybe if it's a very well-written narrative, it can be a fun experience. But if you want a game that actually makes players feel like they were invested in it and therefore at fault for their own loss, you don't want them blaming your game, is what I'm getting at. You don't want someone to say, well, I lost this game because I pulled this card, or I lost this game because I rolled the dice and I rolled a 1. You don't want that, because ultimately what does that do? That makes the player blame the game, and you don't want people blaming your game. Now you want them to blame themselves. We're back to that, right? So you want the game to have choices for the player to make. What does that do? That creates an investment. They feel invested into the game. And what does that create? Tension. And of all things, you want your game to have tension. Tension makes that makes the dopamine and all the things that make a game enjoyable rise up. If you don't have tension, you're just flipping cards, it's not going to be a fun experience. Maybe the first time through, but that game's going to sit on a shelf. Now, you have that choices, which creates investment, which creates tension. You're going to likely have a good design. So that's basically what I wanted to discuss today. I would like to hear your thoughts on what I've said, and of course, point me towards any games that you think, especially solo games, that do this well, that create these choices for players to make that ultimately are to blame for their loss or their victory. So, I mean, I'm always looking at players losing because I'm kind of a jerk in that way, but that's a joke. But it's for the victory. So it's on the flip side of that. When a player wins, you want them to say, I won because I made this choice here. I did spend that 3 ammo, or whatever it might be. You want them to feel like my investment or my choices decided my victory. You don't want them just to be like, well, I flipped a card over and I guess I won. You don't want that. You want there to be their decisions to equate to that. So that's all I have on that topic. Again, please leave comments below, like, subscribe, and all of that. And I'll see you next time. Thanks.